Let's dive right into this explainer because today we're looking at a truly pivotal moment in history. It's this intense collision where ancient geopolitics meets spiritual rebellion in a pretty devastating way. We're getting a front row seat to the collapse of a nation in chapters 6 through 8 of the book of Jeremiah. And you know what? The lessons here about truth, deception, and the massive consequences of just flat out ignoring reality, they're absolutely as striking today as they were thousands of years ago.
To really ground us in the text before we unpack all this historical reality, let me read the source material from TN Insight. Quote, "Hello everyone, this is TN Insight. Let's begin by reading today's scripture passage from the book of Jeremiah, chapters 6 to 8, end quote. By starting right there, we can vividly see the nightmare Jeremiah was dealing with. I mean, he was speaking to a society teetering on the absolute brink, desperately trying to deliver a message they just refused to hear.
Section 1, The Gathering Babylonian Storm. So you have to understand, the geopolitical reality back then was absolutely terrifying. Following the defeat of the mighty Assyrian Empire, Babylon suddenly exploded onto the scene as the dominant, unstoppable superpower under King Nabopolassar. And then he hands that immense power down to his son, Nebuchadnezzar, who basically launches these devastating invasions right against Judah. This whole domino effect leads directly to 586 BC, which is the third and final invasion where Jerusalem finally falls and the city is completely destroyed. It's literally an unstoppable storm coming from the north. Because this threat was moving so incredibly fast, God actually tells the descendants of Benjamin to flee and raise a banner. Now, in the ancient world, that didn't mean waving a flag. It meant sending a desperate visual signal, like lighting a massive beacon fire or sending up a smoke signal from a high hill, just to warn everybody that a massive enemy attack is imminent. Jeremiah actually describes these invaders as being so utterly relentless and eager for war that they are literally lamenting the sunset. Think about that. They were actually wishing they could just keep fighting and destroying straight through the night. The urgency here is just off the charts. Section 2, The Illusion of Peace. So, while this unstoppable enemy is marching right toward their gates, the people of Judah had ears that basically couldn't hear a thing. God describes them as being uncircumcised in heart. And you might be wondering, what does that mean? Well, circumcision was originally the physical sign of their covenant and obedience to God. But their inner refusal to actually obey him made that physical act completely meaningless. They were just going through the motions, completely checking the religious boxes, but their hearts and their ears were totally closed off to the truth. And this creates a crazy contrast between their outward actions and their inward reality. On one hand, they're bringing these incredibly luxurious offerings, highly expensive incense from Sheba, fragrant spices imported from distant lands, stuff that cost an absolute fortune. But God found absolutely zero delight in this. Why? Because their hearts were just entirely corrupt. He flat out rejected these luxurious burnt offerings. All the expensive physical rituals in the world simply couldn't mask their spiritual decay. What's worse is that this deception was completely systemic. It was coming from the very top. The religious leaders were standing up and literally shouting, "Peace, peace," when honestly there was absolutely no peace to be found. They were actively deceiving the public, selling them these comfortable, easy falsehoods that they just wanted to hear, rather than sounding the alarm about the total destruction hurtling toward them. Section 3, A Den of Robbers. I mean, just look at the sheer volume and severity of their daily sins. It is staggering. We're talking about active stealing, committing murder, engaging in adultery, swearing falsely, worshiping the foreign god Baal, and baking cakes for the Queen of Heaven. The hypocrisy is wild. They were committing these detestable acts all week long, only to walk right into the temple and claim, "We are saved." It's a huge wake-up call for us today about how easily self-righteousness can totally blind us to our own toxic behaviors. And historically, their idolatry is deeply, deeply ironic. When it mentions baking cakes for the Queen of Heaven, that's actually referring to the Babylonian goddess Ishtar, a deity of fertility and war. It was a hugely popular pagan practice. You saw similar goddesses worshipped as Asherah in Canaan or Aphrodite in Greece. But here's the catch. The very empire that was marching down to destroy them was the exact same empire whose gods they had started worshiping. No way, right? It's tragic irony at its absolute peak. They were essentially treating the physical temple of the Lord like some sort of magic talisman. It was this mass delusion where they believed that just having the building in Jerusalem somehow guaranteed their safety from foreign armies. But God's reality is completely different. He wanted obedience to his voice way more than their empty sacrifices. He wanted them to actually amend their ways, to stop oppressing foreigners, orphans, and widows. But because they flat out refused, the temple had devolved into nothing more than a den of robbers. Section 4. The Valley of Judgment. So God appoints Jeremiah to act as an examiner of the people, and it's basically like a refiner of metal. The process is pretty straightforward, right? You place silver in a blazing furnace, you attempt to burn away all the impurities, but if the silver remains totally stubborn and impure, you just have to discard it. Well, when Jeremiah examined the people of Judah, that's exactly what he found. They were like worthless, rejected silver that absolutely refused to be purified. And honestly, this impurity reached its darkest, most sickening depths in a place called Topheth. Located in the valley of Ben Hinnom, just southwest of Jerusalem, this valley started out as literally a garbage dump, but it evolved into this horrific shrine. Topheth actually means burning place. The people of Judah were using this site to sacrifice their own children by fire to the pagan god Molech. Because of these unimaginable abominations, this specific valley was slated to become the ultimate valley of death. The consequences of this massive corruption were going to dismantle their society right down to the bedrock. The approaching Babylonian judgment would be total. The text warns that the bones of kings, officials, and priests would literally be dug up and exposed to the sun and moon. Why? Mainly so the Babylonians could plunder the valuable jewels buried with them. Wives and fields would be handed over to the conquerors. God warned of poisonous water and venomous snakes they couldn't escape. Every single sound of joy, gladness, the voices of the bride and bridegroom, it would all be completely silenced in the streets of Jerusalem. It is the total, complete unmaking of a society. Actually, this total collapse was fundamentally a systemic failure of leadership. The tragedy wasn't just the everyday people messing up. It was the complete failure of the intellectual and religious elite. Even nature knows its rhythms, right? The text points out that birds like storks and doves know their appointed times to migrate. Yet somehow God's people didn't know his requirements. And the reason is that the scribes, the very experts supposed to be copying and interpreting the law, were actively leading the people astray. They used deceitful pens to produce straight-up falsehoods, twisting the law to justify worshiping foreign idols.
Section 5. The Weeping Prophet's Sorrow.
Now, there is massive cultural weight behind this very specific command God gives Jeremiah: cut off your hair and lament on the barren heights. You see, in the ancient Near East, having long hair was deeply tied to a person's glory, vitality, and dignity. So to just cut it all off, that was a highly symbolic, super public act of extreme mourning, shame, and sheer humiliation. It was a giant billboard signaling to everyone that the glory of the nation was completely gone. And as the terrifying sounds of enemy horses from Dan get closer, and the people start crying out that the harvest has passed and they still aren't saved, Jeremiah just breaks down. He says, "Since my people are crushed, I am crushed. I mourn and horror grips me." He is so deeply wounded, hearing the agonizing cries of his people as they face the sword or get dragged off into the Babylonian exile. It's a truly heartbreaking reflection of God's own heart, grieving deeply even as he carries out this completely necessary and inevitable judgment. So all of this leaves us with a really heavy, critical question to think about. If God's heart grieved that deeply over a society that completely lost its way, we kind of have to look in the mirror, right? Are we truly listening to the hard truths in our own lives today, or are we, just like the scribes and priests of ancient Judah, simply seeking the comfortable illusion of a false peace? It's an absolutely essential question for our own spiritual reality. Keep digging into the text, and I'll catch you on the next one.